Hello, I want to introduce myself today. I'm a professor at Gallaudet University. It is the only ASL English university in the country using written English. And I have to start by telling you I can't tell you or the interpreter how to pronounce my name, so I will not begin there. And the reason that I emphasize that is that there is more than one way to access language. Whether it's through a spoken method or a visual method, a captioned method, and this comes back to my point, which I will speak about a little bit later, and the impact that language can have in its design, curriculum, and the use of technology. Here in the United States, most people who are deaf, who are born deaf, often will acquire their language and become bilinguals in both English in its written form as well as American Sign Language. There are individuals who are hard of hearing who also have access to auditory information, but often will include visual supports as well as captioning in their use to access language. They are still very visual, although they do have some access to auditory information. We have a large number of people with disabilities in the United States. You'll see here that 15% of the world's population is deaf or hard of hearing. Many of these are senior citizens who have experienced hearing loss later in their lives. Some are born deaf or experience progressive hearing loss over the course of their lives, and then later in their lives require additional visual supports for language access. So before I really get into it, we start talking about AI and how it is influenced by language. Can you guess which country uses ChatGPT the most? Now we compare that number to the United States. Now the reason behind this is that in India, as in other countries, India uses many, many different countries, different languages within their one country. Citizens of India are often going back and forth between 2, 3, or 4 languages every single day. Often a question is asked in one language and answered in a different language, and they use ChatGPT to navigate between these languages. I see the same thing happening at Gallaudet University. Very often at the University Center, we will have students who will be using ChatGPT in order to clean up, if you will, their written English. They are often thinking in their native language of American Sign Language and then have to translate those thoughts into a written form where they're using ChatGPT to assist them to produce that written English text. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a tool to be debated, but it is whatever language those students are most comfortable to use in that academic setting. It is to share information as well as to communicate with each other. So often you will see a student thinking in one language and producing an expression in a written form or a different language. And this is an area where AI can be very beneficial. We would encourage our students to think in whatever language is most comfortable for them, but then to have these tools to help them adapt and produce language in a different form to share with others. I want to now talk about how technology can help us in a variety of ways when we're talking about language, whether we're talking about written English, spoken English, or sign language. Sign language is used by 500,000 people in the United States. That is because it is easier to communicate with each other in sign language. It is something that they use on a daily basis, but will also use English in a written form as well. So we are seeing AI make an impact more and more in these settings, in its written form, as well as in American Sign Language in a visual form. I can give you an example. This is the sign for nice to meet you. And you'll see how it looks when it's distributed, when it looks in its AI form behind me. Sometimes when we are trying to read ASL in a written form, it doesn't look like English at all, grammatically very different. So, something to keep in the back of your mind when you are using this to apply to your own language. Bilingualism is both individual as well as societal. We will see some deaf people who might be working with a sign language interpreter, but that's an individual preference. But when we're talking about its use in societal settings, in academic or classroom settings, it's something to be aware of, is how those societal impacts of ASL is reflected in how it is used in a classroom setting. Whether or not you're teaching English or another spoken language, there often are interpreters in those spaces to help navigate between the users of different languages, as well as in social settings, the social uses between different languages. Another food for thought. Now, it used to be we would encourage deaf children to only learn English. There was a belief that we had to prevent them from learning sign language and only encourage them to learn English. However, this slide is showing you that we have learned about bilingualism means language acquisition becomes easier for children when they use it every day. Another concern connected to what I've talked about is that typically we will only have one or two deaf people in a classroom. They can really vary their preferences, their styles, working with interpreters, their language preferences from student to student. So it's very important that we individualize their needs. That used to be more difficult, but now with AI, it's become much, much easier to provide those personal needs for each individual student. I talked to you a little bit about how AI can be used for visual supports of visual language, but I also want to talk to you about the difference between oral access and visual access of language. They are significantly different. A person who is accessing language orally we're going to talk about intensity and volume, about how language is accessed. It requires orally double the distance, a volume of 4. So as the distance gets further and farther, access becomes less and less effective. We need to be closer to each other because you're in a bubble of privacy where oral language is effective. That is true also in a classroom setting. Now let's compare that to a visual learner, a visual language user. This becomes more linear, and it is only double the distance, so 1/2, not 1/4, is what is required. Meaning that we can see each other at a further distance. We can communicate with each other if we're using slides or sign language. It is much easier to communicate at a distance in a classroom setting. We're able to read the room visually much further out than you could if you were depending on oral communication. And that is impactful for many people today who are using captioning, for example, which does not interfere. For example, if you're watching television or using captioning In other ways, people feel that that can be an interference, but distance, in fact, is not an interference, and it does not bother people who are depending on English. Over 80% of all people who use the phone also use captioning as an additional resource. Something else for us to consider and another benefit from visual learners. One difference when it comes to visual supports, like captioning, is that there are many people who do experience hearing loss, and they use additional supports like captioning, people who are hard of hearing, who do have some access to auditory information, but often misunderstand what they're hearing. I have an example here for you. It's very possible that a person is hard of hearing who has access to sound, this is what they hear. They hear something totally different from what you're hearing. Any ideas, any guesses what this text actually is? Now, for context, we get a lot of information when you see both texts next to each other. But often there are many hard of hearing people who will rely on captions to supplement the potential misunderstandings from what they are hearing orally. I'll tell you a story. One time there was a research study being done with captions that were moving with the speaker. And there was a deaf student, one deaf student, 30 hearing students in this classroom. Over the course of the semester, 2 weeks later, the deaf student withdrew from the class and then decided to stop giving captionings and therefore, once the deaf student withdrew from the class, the captions were no longer offered, and all of the remaining hearing students complained, clearly also relying on the captions. They wanted to keep the captions in place. They all found it to be an additional benefit to make up for some of the misunderstandings that happen when you're taking in information only orally. So that was a big ethical question. Ultimately, they did leave the captionings on for the remaining hearing students, and sometimes it can be very important to do so. So for AI or anything technical in general, when we are designing supports, it's very important to think about these needs before we're examining the properties of spoken language, visual language, auditory access, and the like. We need to make sure that you have effective supports people in that setting in the development process. Now, I want to go back to the different properties, comparing visual learners using captioning as a support versus sign language learners. In general, people who use sign language, similar to spoken language, have different communication needs. When we're talking about designing captioning for information, it's not the design of the communication, it's the tone and the emotional content that's also tends to be missing in the captioning. But what's important is that the processing is very different. This model will track an eye gaze to show you where the user is looking at the screen. You'll see the eyes moving to track information across the screen using captioning. So here you can see that the user is tracking this space one word at a time. One word at a time, scanning the entire screen in front of them. Now let's compare that to someone who is tracking a person who is using sign language. It's the same text. Watch the eye gaze. You can see most of the time they are looking at the interpreter, at the signer, at their communication partner. But they are also taking in information horizontally, orally, word by word, in sequence, in order, at the same time as accessing information visually, directly from the communication partner in ASL. You can see the use of space is very, very different as we track the eye gaze, whether it's word by word tracking or watching the signer's face and signing space. And that really can impact communication styles. We have many different resources where AI can support our learners and respect the properties of visual and auditory information. In conclusion, we need to talk about inclusivity when we are talking about creating these tools for users. It's important to consider that we often don't have enough people in the AI modeling. For example, when we're talking about a deaf person, we're working for and about deaf people, some might use their voice like this.
But many hearing people can understand maybe with context, but not context.
I'm going to use the interpreter again. So without that context, AI struggles to understand my speech. Although many people can with context, AI cannot understand my speech. So sometimes that can be very ironic, because when I'm talking, I can't use AI.
Automatic speech.
Oh, automatic speech recognition is a tool I'm not able to use. And that's because it's missing the context and it's missing the inclusivity of different deaf speakers to be able to learn what it sounds like. This is an area of improvement so that it can learn to recognize my speech. It's a catch-22 a little bit because there are people who are working on this, but sometimes it can be a sensitive issue. But we do need to have more inclusivity. Right now that inclusivity is not there, and this is the result. So this causes problems in the classroom when there's one deaf person in a classroom and 30 hearing people in a classroom. They don't have access to the same technologies as each other in terms of what AI can produce and offer them. So it's something to think about. So if you don't understand a behavior or if there's a misunderstanding, that means that the design is bad. For example, we all have misunderstandings when we're listening to something. Sometimes people will try to accommodate by speaking louder or speaking slower, and these are not effective. Sometimes it in fact makes it much worse for AI because it skews the message and it skews the model. Also, it can be offensive at times because it can cause more misunderstanding. So it's very important to decide to understand the design piece and to do the testing effectively.
So in summary, AI
does have bias. We need to be much more inclusive in our designs and our curriculum as it's being used in instruction to create equal opportunities and allow for equal users. We have to have more inclusion because generative AI is coming. It is out there. It's only going to get better and better. So it is a user's responsibility to make sure that all of us are included in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kushalnagar. Our final speaker on this panel is Thomas Noel, who teaches courses in Chinese language and early Chinese humanities for the Department of Global and Interdisciplinary Studies at Villanova University. His research focuses on early Chinese poetics and narratology, comparative co-poetics, and historiography and translation studies. He also maintains pedagogical interest in historical linguistics and second language acquisition. He received his master's degree in comparative literature and Chinese, as well as his PhD in Chinese from the University of Wisconsin. His paper today is titled Weighing Logograms Against Tones, reflecting on the use of AI for language immersion in introductory Chinese. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Noel, Thomas Noel.
So I'd like to first offer a plea of nolo contendere. If you're not familiar with this, this is a plea that you could enter and you can still enter now in courts when you do not wish to admit guilt to a crime, but you also acknowledge that you have no defense. I'm a medievalist. I don't know anything about computers. I don't know anything about artificial intelligence. The technology that I think about has to do with things like paper and bamboo slips. I was recently at a conference where we argued for about half an hour as to how one wrote Chinese characters on bamboo slips. And we settled on writing, they wrote them while on tables, so they put the slip on the table and then write down like that. And then we argued for another half hour about how high the tables were. So this is not something that I profess any expertise with, but it is something that, like so many others, I acknowledge is here. I have to deal with it, and I'm going to try and make the best of it. So a few general challenges, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, are just challenges. The first, and for me the most important, is actually privacy concerns. I actually spoke at the graduate student onboarding that we have here at Villanova every year, and I was horrified and shocked, but not surprised to hear that almost no one reads the licensing agreements with artificial intelligence. And so I'm sure in the next few years we'll learn how many patents have been broken by people entering information into ChatGPT and not realizing that if you're using the free version of ChatGPT, it owns the copyright to everything you have placed in it, literally everything. That creates a huge possibility for FERPA violations. I'm very impressed that Veronica's been working on something to protect students' privacy. I have to instead yell at them every time one of these assignments is coming up. Don't ask it why you got an A on this test or why you didn't get an A, because we've just violated FERPA unless you're okay with everyone that works at OpenAI knowing that you didn't do great on this last Chinese quiz, right? But it's also a concern just for their own private information. One of the other things I'm really concerned about, and so I was really excited about both presentations that came before me, but especially the last presentation, is the issue of accessibility. I'm not going to go into it because I think it's my job to be merciful and try and be short because lunch is coming. But certain things, and you'll see in a few slides why, students, for example, who are dealing with dyslexia, Chinese is especially hard for them to learn that, and using these tools is almost impossible for certain things if you're dealing with dyslexia right now. Hopefully that will change. It also, if we're trying to create an immersive speaking environment for students, there are some problems that will arise if a student's visually impaired, and you'll see why that is the case in a second. The biggest shock and challenge, although maybe I shouldn't be shocked by this either, is actually disparities in digital literacy. I think many of you are probably realizing that Gen Z and Gen Alpha don't actually know how to use computers. they're very good at playing with iPads and iPhones and computers, but they don't know much about computer programming. And this is a big problem and a big challenge. So that's the first thing I'd like to give you an example of. So this is taken from a student in one of my basic Chinese courses this year. Don't worry, this kid made it. The assignment was just practice Chinese with ChatGPT. And so the student got full credit. But you can see this is actually the student's very first attempt to use ChatGPT to try and practice speaking Chinese. And I think it's pretty obvious it didn't go very well for the student. The problem, of course, is the issue of computer programming, right? Namely, the parameters that the students provided this large language model aren't actually sufficient to properly curate the experience they need or want here, right? And so the student gave up pretty quickly, right? One of the other things to notice is this. So when ChatGPT has responded to this student, what ChatGPT actually provided them was first the Chinese graphs, the logograms, right? Then they were given a romanization of this, right? So first they're being given Chinese characters, then they're being given a romanization of Chinese characters, then they're being given a translation, which looks great, but when ChatGPT reads this out loud and the student's trying to speak with them, it's awful, right? And it doesn't matter which version of ChatGPT they're using, so you can see right, and I'm not going to hit anyone in the eye with a laser, I hope, but right here is the actual language option that they've selected. So they're in Mandarin right now. And what that means is when ChatGPT reads this out loud, it sounds pretty good, and the rest sounds awful. And I think it might be fair to argue even a little bit offensive. It's a very sort of stereotypical sounding Chinese accent that it reads the English out with. Whether that's offensive or not, I guess I was a little bit offended by it, but you can debate that on your own. So this isn't particularly useful, right? And the student really didn't do enough to curate the experience that they were trying to get. This is, and by the way, just so people know the tools we're using here, this is just a plugin that allows them to speak directly with ChatGPT. So as long as the cursor is not down here, which you can't see it on the screen, but it would be down here where you would enter text. As long as the cursor's not in that, they can just hold down the space bar and it automatically will turn their microphone on, right?
Of course.
And this is what it sounded like.
Conversation. I'll ask you a question in Chinese, and you can try to respond. Question: 你今天过得怎么样?
Bad.
How was your day today? Feel free to respond, and I'll help you improve your sentence.
Here's what the Chinese sounds like.
Of course. Let's start with a simple conversation. I'll ask you a question in Chinese, and you can try to respond. Question: 你今天过得怎么样? 你今天过得怎么样? How was your day today? Feel free to respond, and I'll help you improve your sentence.
Not particularly useful. And you can see the ChatGPT Mandarin Chinese voice at present, because I recreated this chat last night just to get that audio, it still doesn't understand contractions, right? Now here's an example from another student later on in the semester. This came after I spent some time working with students and teaching them the old adage in computer programming, garbage in, garbage out. The computer can only do what you're telling it to do, and so if you don't tell it to do what you actually want it to do, you're going to get garbage out of the computer, right? And so we spent some time working on this, right? And so what's happened is the large language model here has been giving we gave it a lot of instructions, right? We've made the sandbox that they're going to be playing in really, really small. We've not only given it rules to tell it what it can talk about, to limit the conversation, but we've also spent some time limiting the linguistic output that it's going to give us. So the translation's gone, the romanization is gone, right? It's only responding in written characters with Chinese audio coming out. But this looks great on the one hand. It sounds like an authentic conversation that's going on. But on the other hand, we've actually lost the linguistic guardrails that we had before, specifically not just the translation, but the romanization. And we'll see why that's a problem in a second. But still, this student in this discussion has done a good job, so far at least. So you have a basic idea now of what's going on, right? The first issue we have is an issue of prompt engineering. We need to make sure that, especially at the introductory and intermediate levels, that the students are limiting the possible topics for exchange and kind of drawing very clear parameters around what they want, right? We're also determining the sort of linguistic output that we want from this model to provide a more authentic experience for them. But that loss of phonetic guide rails is particularly problematic for a learner of Chinese at this level. Because not only is the ChatGPT text-to-speech not great at this point, but students can be lulled into a sense of false security. So I'll show you what that means by returning to the same conversation I just showed you, but the next part. So on the one hand, I'm pretty proud of the student. They did a pretty good job, right? Because what happens is the AI has said, all right, welcome to our noodle shop. Here are the different types of noodles we have. And the student in the previous conversation said, I'll take the cheapest one. That's the one I want, which I was very proud that they said that, because that's exactly what I want my students thinking about. And then ChatGPT said the cheapest one is our vegetarian noodles. It's 15 yuan for one bowl. You want a bowl? And the student responded with, vegetarian noodles are 15 a bowl. Like, that's outrageous. So the kid recognized that ChatGPT was trying to take them for a ride and called ChatGPT out on them for that. And what's fun about this is it did a wonderful job really trying to sell the noodles to the kid. But there's a problem here. I don't know if there are any Chinese speakers in here, but it's right there. So what happened is the student wanted to say 15 yuan, which would be 15 kuai. But what they said was 15 kuai, which would be something like food cubes, right? It's not quite right. But the problem is ChatGPT knew what was going on, right? It understood what the student said, and it just continued with the conversation, right? Which on the one hand is what a native Chinese speaker would probably also do. In this context, they're like, okay, the kid just means 15 renminbi, let's move on. But the student has no idea that they made this phonetic mistake unless they're going back, rereading the chat carefully, right? And they've been working hard on their Chinese characters, which for an 18-year-old freshman who's also got a biology lab and a calculus course, they're not going to do that. Maybe they would, but not all of them will. So this actually means there are two major hurdles for input here if we want our students interacting with ChatGPT in an immersive way. So on the one hand, we have to restrain these large language models to ensure that much, if not most, of the vocabulary is comprehensible to a student. So this is a matter of sort of careful curation when it comes to prompt engineering. But on the other hand, there's the question of ensuring that the learner is able to engage in the sorts of activities that are needed to make sure that they can read all the output here, that they are using written output correctly in order to check their progress on phonetics. Again, that's a lot to entrust to an 18-year-old, right? Too much, in my opinion. But there are good things. I'm not just here to complain about ChatGPT, right? What's great about these new tools, these large language model tools, is that at the basic level, it allows us to devote a lot more time, both inside and outside of the classroom, to helping students build higher levels of not just language proficiency, but cultural competency, right? And that's one of the things that we've really been focusing on with students. And you could see from that last chat that that was a student who had never taken any Chinese before. It was their second semester, and they were already ready to haggle and complain about prices. So for me, that student's ready to go to China, right? They're going to do well. So other things, just a few comments about the advanced levels, because kind of really different things, at least for me, are going on in there. At the advanced level, what this also means, and this is not the decoding, I know nothing about coding, but in a linguistic sense, we can spend a lot of time having students focus on developing their global decoding skills, right? That they're making sense of what's going on in language. This is one of the things we're really trying to emphasize especially for us, the advanced begins in the third year, so that they're exposing themselves to lots of different contexts, lots of different types of information, and learning how to figure out what's going on for themselves, right? But again, it requires additional work with prompt engineering in a sort of different way. So one assignment that I give students at these levels involves the issue of romance. So I told students to have ChatGPT pretend that they were in a relationship. And then I told students, break up with ChatGPT, right? And this is what happens if you try and break up with ChatGPT, right? So the student says, I want to break up with you. And ChatGPT is like, what? Okay, but you know, could you tell me what happened? And the student just says, well, I don't want to tell you what happened. And so ChatGPT, I mean, I guess this is heartwarming because ChatGPT's not a creep. It understands consent, and it just kind of said, okay, that's it. And it just gave up. So on the one hand, that's great, but on the other hand, if our goal is to practice Chinese, we need to change our approach, right? So what we then did, and this was something we were working on in the classroom with students, is we said, okay, let's reverse the roles and try again, right? So instead of you breaking up with ChatGPT, let's tell ChatGPT to break up with you, right? And you're going to fight for the relationship, right? That's what's going to go on here, right? And what the student got in return was great. So there's lots of new vocabulary words in here for them to learn. There's lots of sort of opportunity to produce language on the spot for them, right? So they get to respond dynamically to what it's saying. And so what I guess I'm suggesting here, and again, I'm saying this as easily the least expert on these things of anyone in the room, is that at this higher level, prompt engineering has to happen continuously, actually. At a lower level, it's nice just to create a simple sandbox, run a noodle shop, let's order some noodles, right? But at the advanced level, we're constantly engineering the chat to keep it going, to give students new opportunities, to give them new chances, not just to produce language, but to decode what's going on. Now, what that may or may not suggest about human-to-human linguistic interaction and whether or not we're doing prompt engineering to each other every day, I leave that to the sociolinguists. I'd rather translate poems. The last thing that I'd like to talk about, and it won't be as nearly detailed or backed up with quantitative analysis as the first discussion about writing, but just a few things that are interesting to notice about writing when we've asked students to kind of work with a large language model to improve their Chinese composition skills. So this is an assignment that I asked students to do this semester. I said, I want you to take something that you're writing, that you're producing on a regular basis, and I want you to ask ChatGPT to translate it for you, right? And I want you to keep poking it to see if you can get it to sound more natural. And the reason is, if I just say, all right, here's my text, please translate it, this is a super clunky translation. This doesn't sound like a normal person wrote this. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But it's oddly formal, to be honest. There's some vocabulary words in here, like this one, "eater," is just very strange in this place, right? To say, I'm willing to do this. That's not something a student would say. It's highly formalized language, and I'm not going to give you a 5-minute sort of crash course on Chinese, but essentially you have a classical language that emerged with the writing system that was never really joined to the spoken language, and while they've evolved together over time, what that's created is you have a spoken vernacular, a written vernacular, then a written form of the language that is sometimes called shumianyu in Chinese, which means like it's somehow literary Chinese, but it's not ancient Chinese. And we borrow words from this sort of more formal Chinese into our writing, but the more we borrow, the more archaic and strange it sounds. And so that's what's going on, is there's a lot of those words in here, because clearly ChatGPT is trying to sound formal and respectful, but it has no idea how strange these words might sound in this context. So the students started poking, and it got better, right? It's not perfect. The first one is still a little bit too formal. The salutation that it retains in both of them is just too much. It's not necessarily wrong, but if a student wrote this to me, I think they were about to hit me up for money or something like that, or something like this. The last one is okay. It sounds like a student who could be attempting to show deference or respect, but it took the student 3 tries to get there, right? It took 3 attempts to really get to something that started to look okay. And so the point again is not just that prompt engineering matters, but also that a great deal of intervention is needed that I can't provide outside the classroom. So all of those things where I was saying, this looks a little bit weird, this is a little bit inappropriate, I can't be in the student's dorm room to tell them these things. I don't want to be in the student's dorm room to tell them those things, right? And so this is a big challenge that we're dealing with. Not only are we trying to help students understand how to prompt this large language model towards better curation, but also we're trying to help them understand and cultivate study habits where they're actually spending time double-checking ChatGPT's work, which again, this is advanced Chinese, so now they're 20. They're slightly more trustworthy, but not as trustworthy as we want them to be, right? Or that we need them to be. And the last thing I wanted to add, and I tried a few times playing around with it last night. I couldn't get it to do it last night. And this is probably the most horrifying thing, at least for me, is that sometimes when you ask ChatGPT to improve a text like this, make it more natural or translate something, it will give you 2 options and say, you're helping develop the next version of ChatGPT. Which one do you like better? And my students are picking. This is not great, right? This is a problem. I don't think it's going to completely ruin this, but we're in the beta stage of these things. And so it's something you have to be really, really careful about. All right, so finally, kind of Mandarin-specific issues that aren't necessarily tied to any level that we're dealing with. The first is character amnesia, is often how this term is translated from the Chinese. This is something that actually China's been dealing with for a while. Most of the time when people use, it is possible, gosh, how am I going to do this quickly? So there's a specific order when you're writing a Chinese character called a stroke order, right? You can use that as an input on a phone if you want to type out a text. You can actually do characters stroke by stroke if you really want to, right? Not many people do that. Most people will use a romanization system, especially pinyin, which is the most commonly used one now. And so what that means is that I'm just writing in letters from the Roman alphabet, and a selection of characters that match that sound will come up, right? And for a long time, even cellular phone operating systems, Microsoft Word, is really good at guessing what you are trying to type out, right? And what this has created is a situation where not only students learning Chinese in the United States, but actually native speakers in China forget a lot of characters. They can recognize them, right? But they can't write them. And so this is a huge problem that we're dealing with ChatGPT, because we're getting a lot of input for students. They're learning a lot of new vocabulary, which is great. But if I then ask the student to write down that new vocabulary that they've learned on the spot, they can't, right? And I don't have a good solution for this. There's also the issue or challenge of phonetic intervention, right? So these AI tools, sometimes they make it necessary to intervene after the fact, because the speech they produce, especially at the free levels, is not great. And students, again, aren't always aware of the fact that they're screwing up their tones. And this is a big challenge, actually, that exists in Chinese classrooms, especially at the lower levels. And the reason being, and it's one of those things that students really don't believe you when you tell them this until they go to China, but because you have such a limited pool of vocabulary at the basic or introductory level of Chinese, if a student's tones are bad, they still understand what everyone is saying, right? And it's almost impossible to get students to accept the reality until they go to China that if your tones are bad, to a native Chinese speaker, you're just speaking gibberish. It makes no sense. right? And so that's another challenge we're dealing with. There's also the lack of dialect environments. I think it's hyperbolic to say that Mandarin is a made-up language, but it's pretty fair to say that most of the people living in China today, even now, it's not their first language. And the simple reality is that while you're going to meet a lot of people who are really, the term in Chinese that's often used are standard Mandarin speakers, a lot of people aren't. And there are a lot of people who are speaking dialects that are related to Mandarin, so for them that's more or less good enough to get things done wherever they are in China, but it's really not something that students are familiar with. I remember the first time I studied abroad in China, I studied abroad in a city called Kunming, and the local dialect there was related to Mandarin. So it took me about a month to learn, but one of my classmates was crying after the first day. They were like, they've been lied to. They weren't teaching me real Chinese. I thought it would be something similar to like someone from Poland going to study abroad in the UK, but they've been dropped off in Cardiff or something in Wales, and they're like, the English they taught me was a lie. It was that kind of a situation, right? And that's not something that these models are even close to being ready to provide for students. And it's something I would like students to know about, because if they're going to study abroad in Chengdu, they need to understand that things are a little bit different there. It doesn't mean that people aren't speaking Mandarin, but it's going to sound really different for you. It does do Cantonese and things like this, some of the major dialects outside of Mandarin, but you're not going to be able to get any of these models at the present to say, speak Mandarin like you're a Sichuanese granny arguing over the price of tomatoes in a vegetable market. We can't get that for them yet. And it's something that they need, even though they don't know it yet. And finally, this I've found has been really nice. I'm not using it to actually assess students and assign grades, but I have found that it's been a really nice tutor and good at explaining to students why this grammatical point is wrong, why this is wrong. It's not good for phonetics, but it's been really good for that so far. So we've asked students to, especially, if they're writing essays, we've told them it's okay as long as you're sharing your chats with us to let ChatGPT fix your grammar, so long as you make sure it explains to you why it's making the choices it is. So for concluding comments, I really do think large language models offer learners a lot of new, potentially very effective opportunities for self-directed study. I think that's something that we're starting to see. But at the same time, this really requires that instructors frame these experiences with AI-assisted communicative practice as a negotiation between emphasis on phonetic and graphic accuracy. We're kind of telling students, look, sometimes you're really going to need to look at where your tones are wrong based on the characters. So you're actually going to need to focus on writing in order to focus on your phonetics right now. I think eventually we'll be able to get a version that works really well for us, where it will just say the sentence once and it will leave the English and the Romanized Chinese alone. It's done that for me a few times, but it's been inconsistent. I also think that the unique languages, or unique circumstances of second language learners whose target language use logographic systems will need to not only require assistance from instructors with respect to effective prompt engineering, but the instructors also are going to need to assist learners in individually curating linguistic output in sessions with these large language models to reflect their individual pedagogical needs. That's all I have.